September 1944. A secondary road somewhere between the Seine and the Moselle. Oberstleutnant Kurt Kaufmann, 43 years old, a career logistics officer who had spent 2 decades studying the movement of armies, stood at the edge of a bombed-out crossroads and tried to understand what he was looking at. He had been a prisoner for 11 days. Before his capture, he had commanded the supply section of the 7th Army's rear echelon, a man whose entire professional life had been dedicated to the cold mathematics of tonnage, distance, and fuel. He knew, better than most, what it took to keep an armoured formation moving. What he could not explain was this. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Seine on the 25th of August. It had reached the Moselle by the 5th of September. That was 240 miles in 11 days, with tanks, with artillery, with the full weight of an American field army dragging behind it. And it had not stopped. Not for a day, not for an hour that Kaufmann's intelligence could detect. He had been trained on a simple axiom. An armoured advance of that speed across that distance without a prepared supply base was not possible. The mathematics did not allow it. A single armoured division consumed roughly 350 tons of supplies per day in active operations. Patton had at least 6 divisions in the line. That was over 2,000 tons a day, moving across a road network that the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht had spent years preparing to destroy. Kaufmann later told his American interrogators, according to a declassified Schaeff prisoner of war intelligence summary from October 1944, that he had assumed Patton must be slowing down, that the advance would stall, that the mathematics would win. The mathematics did not win. To understand why, and to understand why German logistics officers from the 7th Army to OB West could not produce a coherent explanation for what they were watching, we need to go back, not to Normandy and not to the Seine. We need to go back to a parking lot in Washington, D.C., and a colonel named Loren Ayers, who had a problem that nobody in the United States Army had ever had to solve before.
Часть первая. Проблема, которую никто не планировал решать.
In the spring of 1944, the Allied logistical plan for the liberation of France was, by any serious measure, a work of optimistic fiction. The plan was called Overlord's Administrative Annex, and it rested on a single foundational assumption. The Allies would capture a major port within 90 days of the D-Day landings. That port, most likely Cherbourg, possibly Brest, would then serve as the anchor for a conventional supply chain. Trains would move inland from the port, depots would be established at regular intervals. The army would advance at a measured pace, pausing every few days to allow the supply tail to catch up. It was the standard model, the one that had worked in North Africa and in Italy, the one that every American logistics planner had been trained on since the Army's Field Service Regulations of 1941. By the 2nd of September 1944, every assumption in that plan was wrong. Cherbourg had been captured, but the Germans had destroyed the port facilities with such thoroughness that it was handling less than 30% of its planned capacity. Brest was still under siege. The railway network that was supposed to carry supplies inland had been destroyed, systematically, methodically, and with considerable effectiveness by the Allied pre-invasion air campaign. The Allies had bombed French rail infrastructure to prevent German reinforcement of the beaches. They had succeeded so completely that they had also prevented their own supply system from functioning. And Patton's Third Army, which had broken out of the Normandy lodgment at the end of July and had been advancing at speeds that made the planning documents look like they had been written about a different war, was consuming supplies at a rate that the pre-planned depots could not begin to match. Hold that number. On the 1st of September 1944, the Third Army's daily supply requirement was approximately 700,000 gallons of gasoline, 3,500 tons of ammunition, and another 1,200 tons of food, medical supplies, and miscellaneous equipment. 700,000 gallons of fuel every day for a force that was 240 miles from its nearest functioning depot. The standard solution, the one in every field manual, the one every logistics officer had been trained to execute, was to halt the advance. Stop, consolidate, wait for the supply system to catch up. This was not a failure of imagination, it was basic operational mathematics. You cannot outrun your own logistics. But stopping was not acceptable, not to Eisenhower, not to Bradley, and certainly not to George Patton, who understood, with a clarity that bordered on obsession, that the Wehrmacht in France in September of 1944 was a beaten force that had not yet been told it was beaten. Every day the advance paused was a day the Germans used to form a new line, to bring up reserves, to transform a rout into a defense. The window was open. It would not stay open. The solution that emerged from this impossible situation was not in any field manual. It was improvised, chaotic, brilliant, and it was built almost entirely on the labor of black soldiers who have been written out of most of the histories that followed. Meet Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres, 41 years old, born in Columbus, Ohio, a former civilian transportation analyst who had spent 3 years before the war working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He had been assigned to the 1st United States Army Group's transportation section in the spring of 1944, and in late August he was given a problem that his superiors described, in the words of a COMZ planning document now held at the National Archives, as the most acute supply emergency in the history of American arms. Ayres and his team had roughly 72 hours to design a system from scratch. What they designed was the Red Ball Express. The concept was straightforward. Designate a one-way loop of roads taken entirely off the civilian network, marked with red balls on every signpost, reserved exclusively for military supply vehicles. Run trucks continuously, around the clock, in both directions simultaneously. One road going forward, loaded, one road coming back, empty. No traffic in the opposite direction. No civilian vehicles. No exceptions. The name came from American railroad slang. A Red Ball freight train was a fast, priority shipment. No stops, no delays, straight through. Ayres knew the terminology. He used it deliberately. He wanted every driver, every dispatcher, every military policeman at every checkpoint to understand that this was not a normal supply run. This was a red ball. It did not stop. On the 25th of August 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. Stop and think about what that means in practical terms. In less than 72 hours, the United States Army had redesigned its entire forward supply system for the European theatre. It had taken highways away from the civilian population of France, painted new signs, established new checkpoints, and mobilized thousands of drivers. The majority of them black soldiers from the Transportation Corps, men who had been systematically excluded from combat roles by an army that had not yet decided whether it believed in their fighting capability. These men would now be asked to drive 10-ton trucks through blackout conditions, on roads cratered by bombs and shelled by the retreating Germans, for shifts that regularly exceeded 16 hours, to keep an army moving that the Germans had already decided could not be moving. Kaufman, in his prisoner interrogation, said he had assumed the American supply system must have a hidden railroad. He could not conceive of another explanation. There was no hidden railroad. There were just the trucks and the men driving them, and a road marked with red balls. 76 dni na krasnych szarach. The Red Ball Express ran from the 25th of August to the 16th of November 1944, 76 days. In that time, it operated on a loop that at its maximum extent stretched from Saint-Lô and Cherbourg in Normandy to railheads and forward depots near Chartres, Dreux, and eventually as far forward as the approaches to the German frontier. The loop covered, at its longest, approximately 540 miles of road round trip. On peak days, over 900 vehicles were in motion simultaneously on the Red Ball loop. The official maximum was set at 6,000 trucks operating per day across the entire system. The actual number exceeded that figure on 23 of the 76 operational days, according to the post-war report of the COMZ Transportation Section. Now let's talk about the men who drove them. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers came from black units of the Transportation Corps. The figure varies slightly in different sources, but the Army's own post-war statistical analysis, published in 1948, puts the black contribution at between 70 and 80% of total driver hours logged. These were soldiers who, in the segregated United States Army of 1944, had been told, formally, in policy documents, in training manuals, in the words of senior commanders, that they lacked the qualities necessary for combat leadership. They were assigned to service and support roles, they drove trucks, and they drove them extraordinarily well. Meet Private First Class Levi Thornton, 20 years old, from Shreveport, Louisiana, the son of a sawmill worker. He had completed 2 years at a segregated high school before the draft. He was assigned to the 341st Quartermaster Truck Company in the spring of 1944, and he arrived in France in August, 3 weeks before the Red Ball began. In a letter home that survives in the Louisiana State Archives, he described the roads in Normandy as worse than anything I ever drove on back home, and I drove on some roads that weren't roads at all. Thornton drove the Red Ball Loop for 41 consecutive days before his unit rotated to maintenance. In those 41 days, he logged just over 22,000 miles. His truck was a GM CCCW, the 2.5-ton cargo truck that the Americans called the Juice and a Half. It carried a payload of 5,000 pounds. Thornton's truck, like most on the Red Ball, was routinely loaded to double that. The Juice and a Half was not designed for what it was being asked to do. The standard operational guidance for the CCKW specified a maximum speed of 45 miles per hour and recommended oil changes every 1,000 miles. On the Red Ball, drivers were instructed to maintain a minimum speed of 25 miles per hour and not to stop for any reason short of a breakdown or an attack. Oil changes happened when a truck broke down, not on a schedule. Tires were changed in the field, engines were rebuilt at the roadside, maintenance kept the loop alive, a chain of repair points spaced every 25 miles along the route, staffed by ordnance companies working in shifts. A truck that broke down was pulled to the nearest point, fixed if possible within 4 hours, and returned to the loop. If it could not be fixed in 4 hours, it was cannibalized for parts, and its driver was assigned to another vehicle. This system, improvisational, brutal, and remarkably effective, kept the trucks moving. Here is the forensic detail that the German post-war analyses consistently missed. The Red Ball Express was not primarily a transportation system, it was a supply rate system. The distinction matters. A transportation system is optimized to move cargo from point A to point B efficiently. A supply rate system is optimized to maintain a constant flow at the forward end, regardless of what it costs at the rear. The Red Ball did not care about efficiency. It cared about the number of tons arriving at the forward depots every 24 hours. Everything else, vehicle life, driver health, road condition, fuel consumption of the trucks themselves, was secondary. The Germans understood efficient logistics. They did not understand this. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express was delivering an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day to forward positions. On the 7th of September, 1944, the day Patton's Third Army reached the outskirts of Metz, the Red Ball delivered 14,412 tons. That figure comes from the COMZ daily tonnage log reproduced in Roland Ruppenthal's Official Army History, Logistical Support of the Armies, published in 1953. 14,412 tons in one day, moving by truck on improvised roads, driven by men working 16-hour shifts in vehicles loaded to twice their rated capacity. Stop and count that yourself. But the Red Ball was not without its fractures, and understanding those fractures is essential to understanding why the system ultimately reached its limit, and why that limit was reached at exactly the moment when Patton was closest to breaking through into Germany. The fuel problem was recursive. The trucks of the Red Ball Express consumed enormous quantities of the very fuel they were carrying forward. The longer the loop, the more fuel the trucks burned in transit. By mid-September, as the front moved east and the Red Ball loop extended, the trucks were consuming approximately 30% of the fuel they carried before it ever reached a forward depot. On some of the longest runs, that figure reached 40%. You were burning your cargo to deliver your cargo.
And the drivers were braking. Not metaphorically, physically. The Army's own medical records from the Red Ball period, summarized in a 1945 Medical Corps report, document a sharp spike in accidents beginning around the third week of operations. Drivers falling asleep at the wheel, trucks going off the road in the dark, collisions at intersections despite the one-way system. The Army responded by issuing benzodrine and amphetamine tablets to drivers on the longest runs. This helped in the short term. It made the problem worse in the second and third weeks as sleep debt accumulated. Levi Thornton, in a second letter home dated the 19th of September, wrote, "I am not sure what day it is. I think it is Sunday, but it might not be." He was 20 years old. He had been driving for 25 days straight. That operation was working. It was also consuming the men who ran it. Люди, подобные Леви Торнтону, управляли этой системой на пределе человеческих возможностей. 20 лет. Луизиана. 22 тысячи миль за 41 день. Если это расследование дает тебе более ясную картину того, как снабжение Паттона выглядело в реальности, не той версии, которая выжила в официальных отчетах, а той, которую люди записывали, когда думали, что их никто важный не читает, нажми на лайк. Это помогает удержать эту историю на виду чуть дольше, и это имеет значение. Часть 3. Предел системы и немецкое непонимание. Express operations reached their peak in the second week of September 1944 and then began to die. Not suddenly, not catastrophically. It died the way all improvised systems die, gradually, from accumulated stress, from the compounding of small failures into large ones, from the growing gap between what the system was designed to do and what it was being asked to do. By the 15th of September, the front had moved so far east that the Red Ball loop had stretched beyond its functional limit. The round trip from the Normandy depots to the forward positions near the German border was now over 1,000 miles. At an average speed of 25 miles per hour, with loading and unloading time, a single round trip took between 40 and 50 hours. Drivers who had been running the shorter loop in 16-hour shifts were now on the road for 2 days at a stretch. The maintenance system, designed for a 500-mile loop, was overwhelmed, and the trucks themselves were failing. The GMC CCKW was a robust vehicle. It was not indestructible. The Army had brought approximately 5,000 trucks to France for the initial operations, with a planned replacement rate based on normal wear. The Red Ball's operating tempo was approximately 4 times the normal wear rate. By the 1st of October, an estimated 23% of Red Ball vehicles were non-operational at any given time, either broken down, awaiting parts, or undergoing major repair. The pool of available trucks shrank every week. This is the moment where the German failure of understanding becomes most acute. German logistics officers at OB West, the Army Group Command responsible for defending against Patton's advance, had been producing intelligence assessments of American supply capacity throughout August and September. These assessments were, almost uniformly, wrong. Not slightly wrong, structurally wrong. Wrong in the way that happens when you apply the correct analytical framework to the wrong system. The German assessments assumed that the Americans were operating a conventional supply chain, depots, railheads, scheduled convoys, standard vehicle loads. They calculated American supply capacity based on road capacity, vehicle numbers, and standard load factors. By this calculation, the American advance should have stalled in early September at the latest. When it did not stall, the German analysts concluded that their vehicle count must be wrong. They assumed there were more trucks than they had counted. They increased their estimates. They still could not make the numbers work. What they never considered was the possibility that the Americans were simply breaking every rule in the logistics manual simultaneously, running trucks at double their rated load. running drivers past the point of safe operation, consuming 40% of their fuel cargo in transit, cannibalizing vehicles that broke down rather than waiting for spare parts. Building a system that was, by any conventional measure, destroying itself, but destroying itself slowly enough that it could deliver what was needed right now, in this week, in this month, before the system finally collapsed. Nothing about this system was sustainable. It was never intended to be sustainable. It was intended to last long enough. Now meet Major General Everett Hughes, 58 years old, born in Stony Brook, New York, a West Point graduate of the class of 1908, who served as Eisenhower's personal logistics inspector during the campaign. Hughes had been traveling the Red Bull route in the second week of September, conducting the kind of informal inspection that never appeared in official reports, but always appeared in his private diary, which is now held at the Library of Congress. His diary entry for the 12th of September 1944 reads in part, "The drivers look like men who have forgotten what sleep is. The trucks look like men who have forgotten what maintenance is. The road looks like a war. It is working. I do not know how it is working. I am not sure it should be working. But it is working, and that is what matters. It is working. I do not know how it is working. That sentence is the heart of this entire story. Because that was the answer to every German intelligence question about the Red Bull Express. It was working because the men driving it refused to let it stop. Not because of doctrine, not because of a superior logistical system. Because individual men, most of them black, most of them from the rural south and the urban north, most of them performing jobs the army had decided were beneath the dignity of a combat soldier, made a decision, shift by shift, mile by mile, to keep going. Over its 76 days of operation, the express route delivered a total of 412,000 tons of supplies to forward Allied positions. That figure is from the official ComZ final report submitted in December 1944. 412,000 tons, moved by truck across 500 miles of French road, by men working double shifts in vehicles loaded to twice their capacity. Patton's Third Army, in those same 76 days, advanced from the Seine to the borders of Germany, liberated a significant portion of northeastern France, and came within a functioning supply line of breaking into the Reich itself. The reason it did not break into the Reich was not the Wehrmacht, it was the fuel. On the 28th of September 1944, Patton's Third Army received 232,000 gallons of gasoline. Its daily requirement for active offensive operations was 700,000 gallons. That is 33% of what was needed. His tanks stopped, not because the Germans stopped them, because the Red Bull, stretched to its absolute limit, could no longer push enough fuel forward fast enough. Kaufmann's assumption that the advance would stall because the mathematics would win was eventually correct, but it was correct 3 weeks later than he had calculated, and in those 3 weeks, the Wehrmacht in France had been shattered beyond any possibility of reconstitution. The mathematics did win, they just took longer than anyone expected, because of the men in the trucks. Часть четвертая. Verdict? Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Nothing about this operation qualified as logistical innovation in the classical sense. It was not a new technology. It was not a new doctrine. It was not even a particularly sophisticated system. It was, at its core, a decision to trade long-term sustainability for short-term delivery rate, and to make that trade aggressively, without hesitation, at a moment when the strategic situation demanded it. The German failure to understand the Red Bull Express was not an intelligence failure. It was a conceptual failure. German logistics doctrine, sophisticated, well-developed, and in many respects superior to American doctrine in conventional conditions, was built around the concept of sustainable operations. You maintained your vehicles. You rested your drivers. You ran your supply system at a rate that it could sustain for weeks and months, not days. This was rational, it was correct. It was also, in the specific conditions of France in August and September of 1944, completely irrelevant. The Americans were not trying to build a sustainable supply system. They were trying to win a war in a window that they understood, instinctively, if not always explicitly, was closing. Every day the Wehrmacht was given to recover was a day it used. Every pause in the advance was translated, almost immediately, into a new defensive line, a new set of obstacles, a new calculation that the Allies would have to pay for in blood. That calculation had one answer, a temporary solution built to last exactly as long as it needed to last, and no longer. Let's be precise about what it cost. Over 76 days, the Red Ball Express consumed approximately 170,000 gallons of fuel per day in the trucks themselves, fuel that was never delivered to the front. It wore out vehicles at 4 times their rated operational tempo. It accumulated a maintenance debt that took the Transportation Corps until the spring of 1945 to fully pay off. Roughly 1,100 vehicles were total losses, written off completely, beyond repair, stripped for parts and abandoned. Hundreds of drivers were injured in accidents. The amphetamine distribution program created dependency problems that the Army's Medical Corps was still documenting into 1945. These are the costs that don't appear in the victory narrative. Now consider the German side of the ledger. By the time the Red Ball Express reached its operational limit in late September, the Wehrmacht had lost, according to post-war German army records compiled by the US Army's Historical Division, approximately 240,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in France since the 6th of June. 3 entire field armies had been effectively destroyed. The Falaise Pocket alone had consumed the combat power of over 15 German divisions. The Army Group B, that stood on the German frontier in October of 1944, was, in the words of its own commander, General Feldmarschall Walter Model, a collection of remnants. It was a collection of remnants because Patton's tanks had kept moving, and Patton's tanks had kept moving because the trucks kept running, and the trucks kept running because the men driving them refused to stop. Read that line again. What does the German analytical failure tell us? It tells us something important about the limits of any doctrine, however sophisticated. German logistics officers were applying a framework built on the assumption that their opponents were rational actors operating within the same constraints that they themselves operated within. This assumption was not unreasonable. It had been valid in every previous campaign. What they could not account for was an opponent who had decided, at the highest levels of command, that the constraints were negotiable, that the rules could be broken if the strategic situation demanded it, and that the cost of breaking them was acceptable. Eisenhower made that decision. Bradley executed it. Patton benefited from it. But the men who actually broke the constraints were the drivers of the Transportation Corps, black soldiers from Louisiana and Georgia and Illinois and New York. Men who were considered by the Army's own racial policies to be unsuitable for the kind of heroic, visible, individually celebrated combat that fills the histories. They drove trucks. They kept driving. They did not stop. That is the sentence that Kaufman could not explain. That is the sentence that broke the German line. Now think about what that means. Levi Thornton survived the war. He returned to Shreveport, Louisiana in the spring of 1945. He worked for a trucking company for 31 years. He died in 1997 at the age of 73. His service in the Red Ball Express was not mentioned in his obituary. He did not receive a combat decoration. The Army did not, at the time, have a mechanism for decorating a man for driving a truck very fast for a very long time. The 341st Quartermaster Truck Company, Thornton's unit, was deactivated in 1945. Its records are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They have not been digitized. Everett Hughes, the logistics inspector who wrote that diary entry in September, retired from the Army in 1951 as a lieutenant general. He died in 1957. His diary, with its quiet, bewildered observation, "It is working." I do not know how it is working, remains one of the most honest documents produced by any senior officer in the European theatre. And Kurt Kaufmann, the Oberstleutnant who stood at a bombed crossroads and tried to make the mathematics work, he spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in England. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. His post-war interrogation summary, 9 pages of careful German logistics analysis applied to a system that consistently defied it, is filed in the Schaef Intelligence Archives under the heading Enemy Assessment of Allied Supply Capabilities, Errors and Misconceptions. The title is accurate. Go back to that crossroads. Kaufmann standing in the September dust, watching the American convoys move east, trying to count the trucks, trying to make the numbers work. The mathematics telling him this was not possible. The mathematics were right. It was not possible. It happened anyway. It is working. I do not know how it is working. That is the sentence. That is the whole story. An army that should have stalled in September of 1944 did not stall, because thousands of men in 10-ton trucks decided, one shift at a time, that the rules about what was possible did not apply to them. They were right. The rules did not apply, and the cost of that decision, paid in worn-out engines and exhausted bodies, and vehicles stripped to their frames on the side of a French road, was the price of a window that stayed open 3 weeks longer than it should have. 3 weeks that shattered an army. German analysts never accounted for those 3 weeks. Levi Thornton drove through those same 3 weeks without knowing what day it was. If this investigation gave you something you didn't have before, press like. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most decisive logistics operation in the history of American arms was run primarily by men the army had decided weren't fit to fight. They were fit. They were more than fit. They just drove trucks.